In the early 1930s, it became apparent that a slew of older Royal Navy submarine classes would soon be obsolete and in need of replacement. A number of these were quite large, mine layers and early attempts at fleet submarines, whilst others were very, very small. It was also hoped that a unified, smaller number of classes would be able to fulfill these various roles, which would greatly help with maintenance. The S-class, the latest class to be built in large numbers, were really too small for long-distance overseas operation. The Thames class, considerably larger, were actually too large, considering the 1930s treaty limits on submarines, and the Grampus class were mine layers. With the smaller boats being replaced by early U-class submarines, the need for a long-range overseas attack sub would be met by the new T-class. However, this design would not be scaled down from the fleet subs, but rather scaled up from the S-class. Initially, the specification was 800 tons standard displacement with a single 3-inch gun and 10 torpedo tubes, 6 internal and 4 external, with 16 torpedoes carried, 1 in each tube, plus a single reload for each internal tube. Surface speed would be a relatively pedestrian 14.5 knots, but underwater top speed would be surprisingly swift for the time at 9 knots. But as questions about underwater endurance and overall range rattled around, the displacement rose, first to 1,000 tons and then still higher, as a high priority on significant battery capacity was emphasised. Various ideas were tried to keep the overall size down, including external fuel tanks between the pressure hull and the casing, but for a change, performance was emphasised as absolutely not to be compromised, and so with plenty of headroom before they hit the treaty limits on displacement for submarines, they eventually settled on 1,095 tons standard. In the delightful world of submarines, that also comes with two other figures: 1,300 tons displacement on the surface, and just a fraction under 1,600 tons when fully submerged. The 9-knot underwater top speed was maintained thanks to a pair of 1,450 horsepower electric motors, whilst a pair of 1,250 horsepower diesels drove the sub to 15.5 knots on the surface, the higher speed with less power being thanks to there being less resistance through the water. Armament started up on deck with a single 4-inch deck gun, as well as mounting points for various machine guns, along with 6 internal bow tubes and 2 external tubes mounted above the 6 internal ones. This gave it a distinctive forward humped fairing, and there was another pair of external tubes amidships. These also fired forward, but could only be fired when the submarine was submerged in order to avoid the torpedoes hitting the side of the boat on the way down. Total torpedo load remained 16, 1 reload per internal tube, but the sub could get off a single devastating 10 torpedo forward salvo. A tactic that was developed in light of this capability was to try and get the sub as close into a key enemy warship formation or large convoy as possible, fire everything, then dive, run and reload. In theory, a 10 torpedo spread should ensure that something was going to get hit, and then the remaining torpedoes could be used to finish off any survivors. The submarines would be built in 3 groups. 15 spread out over 3 years formed the Group 1 pre-war boats. 7 formed Group 2 boats ordered at the start of the war, and a total of 40 were ordered over 1940 through 42 as a pared-down Group 3 design, which had various features taken off to enable rapid wartime construction, although 9 of this latter group would be cancelled at the end of the war. Some modifications were also made to the class. The machine guns would be replaced with more permanent 20mm Oerlikon installations as the war went on, usually 1, but occasionally there were 2. The upper external tubes forward were moved back slightly to improve overall speed underwater. The amidships tubes were reversed to aim backwards following complaints about the lack of a stern tube, and a single reloadable stern tube was also added to wartime-built boats and refitted to some of the earlier ones. 2 of the Group 1 boats would also have their forward external tubes removed entirely during refits, again for better seakeeping and speed. The pre-war loss of Thetis to an internal torpedo tube door that was left open whilst the outer door was also open led to various improved safety measures in that department, and the sub was also salvaged and recommissioned as HMS Thunderbolt. World War II saw mixed results. Initially, the class was based in the Far East and in home waters. Off of Norway, they saw some success, including sinking the cruiser Karlsruhe, but also accidentally sinking fellow submarine HMS Oxley. The submarines that were specially trained and deployed to the Far East for open ocean warfare were recalled to the Mediterranean, where their larger than ideal size for that theatre led to significant losses from anti-submarine warfare efforts and minefields. Having thus left the area just before Japan declared war, the class saw relatively minimal activity in the Far East until the latter part of 1943, when they returned and began to prey on Japanese shipping. The class seemed to have a particular taste for enemy submarines, sinking at least 14 of them, which was 23% of all Axis submarines lost to Allied submarines, although the T-class made up less than 9% of the combined US, British and Dutch submarine fleet, let alone the other Allied subs. After numerous upgrades and adaptations, the surviving boats were still considered useful in the post-war environment. Some subs were lengthened, streamlined and given more engine and battery power, with the T-class remaining on the active duty roster in various forms until 1969. 7 subs served in other navies. 4 went to the Dutch Navy, 2 during wartime and 2 afterwards, and 3 were sold to Israel in the mid-1960s. INS Dakar, ex-HMS Totem, vanished en route to her new home. The rediscovered wreck yields no particular clues as to why exactly it sank. Truncheon and Turpin, renamed Dolphin and Leviathan, made it, and they would serve for about a decade, being decommissioned in the late 1970s.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.